Wait, Tim, you're ready.
I present the responsibility of the innocent, the responsibility of us. The United States is often regarded as the pinnacle of liberty for the Western world, not because it's unique in its intention to its constituents, but instead due to the foundations from the ground up that ensured from the first day of independence that freedom would be upheld. Nonetheless, these rights presented to us by our founding fathers come with a larger responsibility. In specific situations, the citizen population, the future of the United States, upholds their responsibility to ensure their own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These proposed situations of maximized participation work to further the representative constitutionalized republic that we founded so many years ago. When the need arises to make a drastic political or social change, the only viable and foolproof solution is that of citizen demand through direct action. In fact, one could even promote the idea that since its founding, every major change that we've had in the United States followed directly after citizen demand, but not government priorities. And this is rather important, because despite the freedom that we have been endowed with from birth, the United States history has been plagued with injustice, persecution, and discrimination, darker than we could imagine. In specific situations, the citizen population doesn't actually get what they want, proposing that we are not a representative constitutionalized republic, since the government pushes their own political agendas, as citizens have to demand their own action. A prominent example of this took place during the Civil Rights era, when, as assistant professor at the University of Arkansas, Maria D. Gist explains in detail, during Reconstruction, the attitudes and prejudices that had framed enslavement in the past were helping to cement the Jim Crow system. And by 1954, despite the vast advancements that we had seen in our society, African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens. Gist explains that the reasoning behind this was a lack of defined law by governing powers on this issue. You see, instead of focusing on the Reconstruction amendments themselves, governments focused on Supreme Court case interpretations in the 1857 Dred Scott v. Sanford and the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court cases. The government proves time and time again that it in itself cannot prove the prioritization that citizens would like to see in the status quo, but instead, citizens have to stand up and do it themselves. And that's exactly what happened. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. released his letter from Birmingham jail, addressing the injustices plaguing African Americans every day. His reasoning was simple. He stated, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. So am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown." He reminded his constituents time and time again that they know from painful experience that freedom was never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Those words still resonate as extremely important today, not only in social issues, but political ones as well. Fast forward a few decades, Maria Taylor expands on detail inside of her novel Climate Change, What Australia Knew and Buried, specifically focusing on instances where governing powers were not following the will of the constituents on issues of climate change. She outlined in 2014 a report was released discussing melting of the West Antarctica ice cap, beginning in an irreversible fashion, and by the end of the century promised to raise sea levels by 1.2 meters. This was revolutionary, and this graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration expands on the problem in detail. Going from the 1980s into the late 2000s, the rate at which glacier ice caps were melting was accelerating beyond a pace that we could control, pushing for international action. And that action did take place. 3 decades ago, Margaret Thatcher confronted the UN National Assembly, pushing for change. She stated it was the responsibility of individual nations or groups of nations to ensure that they were doing their part to solve issues as an international community, but not as individuals. You see, issues such as climate change can only be solved if every member is working to their best of their ability. She proposed solutions to agriculture to fix pollution and a more heavier reliance on nuclear energy. And during this time, there was even widespread fear that climate change would have lasting effects. So let's see what happened 3 decades later, as the United States was present at this council. Well, not much. The Environmental Protection Agency serves the mandate to ensure, well, that the environment is protected here in the United States. And they did that for some time. But pushing into 2017, the President of the United States released Executive Order 13777, titled Reducing Regulation and Cutting Regulatory Costs, where every legislation that was put in place for the purpose of protecting the environment ensured that 2 legislation must be removed, pushing for steps in the opposite direction. The Environmental Protection Agency was extremely compliant with this order and even supported it. For the mandates that were specifically done for the purpose of protecting our environment can no longer even do their job. The solution to this issue would be to maximize citizen representation, to ensure that each of us has a voice to solve these pressing issues. And that solution is that of compulsory voting. Compulsory voting conveys the idea that every vote is expected and valued, as explained by Chapman, a political scientist at Stanford University. Voting is not something that is mutually exclusive to the elites of society, but is instead intended for everyone, even those in the margins of society. Of course, this solution does come with limitations and objections, as Melissa DeWitt of Stanford University expands on in detail. Specifically, 3 objections. Firstly, this will lead to an increase in uninformed voters inside of elections. Secondly, the individuals will begin to vote out of fear for being punished for not voting. And finally, this is a removal of constitutional rights to remain out of elections. However, each of these limitations can at least be partially addressed by the solution. First, on the issue of uninformed voters, this is something that could potentially be solved by mandatory voting, by ensuring that every citizen was compliant with these laws and was ensured that they were inside of the political system. On the issue of voting out of fear, Chapman points to Australia, a country who has had mandatory voting since 1924, where 87% of the population states that they would definitely or probably still vote, even if it was not mandatory. And on the issue of constitutionality, she simply looks at the other side of the coin. Today, we're seeing 40% of the United States population remain out of elections. But with this solution, we could see a community focusing on common goals, pushing to actually solve issues like climate change, and remove the entire necessity for another civil rights movement. Thank you.
Caden, question number 1. How did you select the strategies you used to gather information or conduct research, and were they effective?
The main strategy that I utilized right after formulating my question was focusing on the history of persecution inside of the United States and pushing from there to look towards political scientists to see what their opinion was on the issues facing the United States government and citizen representation. I would argue that this was extremely effective, as learning from the history of the United States pushed us into the solution of fixing the problem in the future.
Question number 2. How did you use the conclusions and questions of others to advance your own research?
The conclusions that I mainly came up with on the issue of compulsory voting were that of negativity, since they argued that it was going against the constitutional rights of American citizens. However, I utilized these specifically to focus on the positive impacts of compulsory voting. Melissa DeWitt's arguments inside of her paper were revolutionary, discussing the negatives that Australia faced. However, when looking towards the positives that they also had, it could seem that this is a viable solution for the future.
Thank you.